Did President Trump have anything to do with the cancellation of Stephen Colbert's show?
Well, here's what's important to keep in mind is a broader dynamic. When President Trump ran for election, he ran right at these legacy broadcast media outfits. There's a lot of consequences that are flowing from President Trump deciding, I'm not going to play by the rules.
I asked you a very direct question. I did not hear a yes or a no in your answer.
Trump's FCC chair notably is not denying that Trump played a role in CBS's decision to cancel The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And now the people who make that show are demanding answers. The Writers Guild of America, which represents both the writers of The Late Show and many of the journalists at CBS News, is calling on New York Attorney General Letitia James to investigate the decision for potential wrongdoing. It is just one of the many examples of how writers, creators, and journalists are refusing to bend the knee to Trump, even as some of their bosses in the C-suite give in to his demands. Joining me now is David Enrich, Deputy Investigations Editor for The New York Times and the author of Murder the Truth, Fear the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. David, thank you for being here. I don't know if you knew at the time when you wrote this book, maybe you did, how much of a forecaster you would be in some ways. Let me just start by asking you about this whole Paramount saga. I mean, it began with Trump's incredibly thin defamation case against CBS and 60 Minutes. You are someone who has just written a whole book about the effort to weaponize defamation cases like this in order to hack away at the First Amendment. As you've watched the last several weeks, how are you thinking about this moment? How should we think about this moment?
Well, these threats work and these legal actions work. And we're seeing that play out in real time. And first with ABC News at the end of last year, now with CBS. And I think the concerning thing that we're starting to see is that it's not only resulting in big companies paying millions of dollars to Donald Trump, it is also, I think, at risk of changing what is the journalism that's being done and how people are speaking about the president. And it's starting to instill fear in some people. And I think that's exactly what the Trump administration is hoping. And I think it's a really dangerous kind of slide away from the values of this country and the First Amendment.
One of the things is I've tried to explain this to people that concerns me, that much of this concerns me, is that in these editorial rooms, the public doesn't know what the discussions are in these editorial rooms. They don't know what calls come down from corporate or what calls come down from anywhere to tell people to soften a story, kill a story, things along those lines. Help explain to people, do you agree with me, first of all, but help explain to people how there's a lot that people don't see, and that's something that we should also be paying attention to and asking questions about.
Well, I think I don't want to overstate what's happening, right? I mean, there are a lot of news organizations out there and a lot of independent journalists and smaller news outfits out there that I think are really fearless and courageous and are doing the right thing. But the truth is, when you are doing big kind of hard-hitting journalism that affects really powerful and rich and maybe litigious people, you have your lawyers review your work. You look closely at that. And obviously, nobody wants to get sued. And no one wants to have a headache with the most powerful person in the world, especially when that person and his administration have shown a tendency to not just do the stuff in the courts, but to use the leverage that they have running the federal government as kind of a cudgel with which they can beat you outside of the judicial system. So there are a lot of really powerful incentives at play that can lead people, even on the margins, to kind of pull some punches and start dialing back coverage and criticism. And I think, again, we're not really seeing very many very clear signs of that yet. And I think that's what makes a lot of people kind of skittish about what happened with Colbert, is that is arguably one of the first big signs that we have seen recently.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, I should have been more specific. What I mean is, when I read that EP, the statement from the EP, from the former executive producer from 60 Minutes, he seemed to be suggesting he didn't feel he could have journalistic independence. And that's what most news organizations have. That's what we have. That's what people should demand. But it is concerning and something we just don't know enough about. Let me ask you, one of the things that struck me in your book is how much you talk about how much the conservative movement used to oppose the kinds of frivolous defamation cases Trump now favors, which is a really interesting point. I didn't know, and I learned. I mean, 15 years ago, Jeff Sessions and Stephen Miller were even championing bipartisan legislation to strengthen protections against these kind of lawsuits. What happened?
I mean, in a word, Trump happened. And there is a long bipartisan tradition in this country going back many decades where people on both the right and the left and everywhere in between recognize that having a free press is really important to our democracy. It's a check on concentrated power, regardless of which party is in the White House. And that consensus really collapsed starting around 2016, which not coincidentally was when Trump began his rise to power and used the media as a big punching bag, and also really set out to undercut and destroy the legitimacy of people and institutions that were willing to stand up to him and that were willing to call out lies when he lied, or call out distortions when his administration distorted the facts. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen these types of tactics really taking, these legal threats and these lawsuits really taking off in popularity at the exact same time that we have a White House and an administration that has really, and not often, but not always, but often, really tried to advance its agenda using lies and distortions. And it's very convenient to discredit the media when they are going to be the ones calling you out on those lies and distortions. So it's kind of a real symbiotic situation that they've created, where people don't trust the media. They're threatening to sue the media. And it's the media that, at least in theory, should be providing a real check on dishonesty and deception.
No question about that. They're also limiting who has access to a lot of these officials and who's in the briefing room. David Enrich, thank you so much. It's a really excellent book. People who want to know more should pick it up. Pick it up this weekend. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.